In the quiet town of Greenville, Georgia, the streets were always lined with oak trees that whispered in the wind. The people here lived simple lives, surrounded by sprawling farmlands and the calming hum of nature. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, and secrets were rare unless they were well hidden. Pastor Thomas Harrington had been the town's spiritual leader for almost 15 years. He was a beloved figure, admired for his unwavering faith, his devotion to his family, and his role in leading the local congregation at the First Baptist Church. His wife, Rachel, stood by his side through it all, a quiet and graceful woman who seemed to embody the same serenity as the life they led. Together, they were the perfect couple, the type everyone looked up to and no one ever questioned. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, there was a darker, more sinister side that no one had ever suspected. It started one Saturday evening, when Rachel had been out running errands. She had planned to come home early, cook dinner, and spend the night with her husband. But as she approached the house, she noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to hear faint noises coming from inside. She hesitated for a moment, but then decided to go in. Her heart raced as she stepped through the door, her mind racing with the thought that something wasn't right. She called out to Thomas, but there was no response. The house felt eerily still, and the air seemed thick with tension. Rachel's eyes quickly darted to the hallway leading to their bedroom, where she noticed a faint light coming from beneath the door. As she walked closer, the sounds grew louder, a strange combination of muffled voices and quiet moans. Confused and anxious, she slowly turned the doorknob. What she saw next would change everything. Inside the bedroom, Thomas, the man she had spent her life with, was lying on their bed with their adopted son, Eli. The young man, barely 18, was draped across Thomas in a way that made Rachel's stomach churn. Eli's hands were on Thomas's chest, and Thomas's hands were tangled in Eli's hair. They were so caught up in each other that they didn't even hear the door open. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She staggered backward, her mind racing to process what she was seeing. The shock hit her like a wave. This couldn't be happening. Her husband, the pastor, the man she trusted more than anything, was engaged in something that defied every belief she had held dear. Her mind was overwhelmed with disbelief, and for a moment, she simply stood frozen in the doorway. Then, without thinking, she screamed. The sound was raw and filled with heartbreak, and it echoed through the house. Thomas and Eli immediately jumped apart, panic flashing in their eyes as they realized they had been caught. Thomas scrambled to cover himself, his face flushing with shame. Eli, equally as startled, quickly dressed, his face a mixture of guilt and fear. "Rachel!" Thomas called out, his voice strained. "I can explain. This isn't what it looks like." Rachel stood in the doorway, her body shaking with rage and confusion. She could barely form words, her emotions running wild. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could manage was a choked sob. You and Eli," her voice cracked. How long? How long has this been going on?" Thomas, now fully dressed, stepped toward her, his hands outstretched in an attempt to calm her. "Rachel, please, it's not what you think. It's complicated." But Rachel could hardly hear him. The shock of the betrayal was too much, and her mind couldn't grasp the enormity of what she had just discovered. Her world, her entire reality, was falling apart before her eyes. "You ... Rachel's voice shook with disbelief. "You let this happen in our home? You brought him into our lives, our family, and this is how you repay me?" Eli, who had been standing silently by the bed, finally spoke up. "Rachel, we didn't mean for this to happen. It just did." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered. You've destroyed everything." She turned to run, to escape the suffocating reality that was closing in on her. But as she reached for the door, Thomas grabbed her arm, his grip tight and desperate. "Rachel, please, just listen to me. I can explain everything." But Rachel, too consumed by rage and betrayal, wrenched her arm away. "No, I've heard enough. I've seen enough. You don't get to explain anything. I want you out of my life." Without another word, Rachel ran out of the house, her heart breaking with each step she took. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away, had to escape the nightmare that her life had become. That night, Rachel didn't return to the house. She stayed with a friend, struggling to process the unimaginable truth. How could her husband do this to her? How could the man she had trusted, the man she had supported, betray her in such a way? And what was worse, what was far more terrifying, was the realization that this had been going on for a long time, hidden beneath a mask of normalcy. The next day, Rachel went back to the house to confront Thomas. She demanded answers, her voice shaking with rage and pain. But Thomas, as calm as ever, tried to explain, to justify his actions. He told her that his relationship with Eli had begun innocently. At first, he had just wanted to help the troubled young man. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. He had fallen in love with Eli, or at least that's what he claimed. Rachel couldn't believe it. He was her husband, the man she had pledged her life to, and now he was telling her that he had been in a secret relationship with their adopted son, the very person they had brought into their home, into their family. The conversation escalated quickly, and Thomas, realizing that Rachel was never going to forgive him, did something that no one could have predicted. The morning after Rachel's confrontation with Thomas, she didn't sleep a wink. Her mind was racing with thoughts she couldn't escape, and the image of what she had seen the night before kept flashing before her eyes. Each time she closed her eyes, she could see the pain in Thomas's face as he tried to explain himself, but the words never made sense. Nothing he said could undo the betrayal she had witnessed. Rachel knew she needed to make a decision, but the choices were agonizing. Should she confront Thomas again, demand answers, or just leave him behind? She couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that the man she had married, the man she had once loved and trusted, was gone. What remained was a stranger, someone capable of unimaginable betrayal. She was torn, unsure of what was next. But one thing was clear. She couldn't go on living with this secret, this lie that had torn apart everything she had believed in. That afternoon, Rachel returned to the house, her heart pounding with each step she took toward the door. She knew it was inevitable. She had to face Thomas, even if it meant facing the truth she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Inside, Thomas was sitting in the living room, his face grim and heavy with guilt. Eli was nowhere to be seen. Likely he had taken off, leaving Rachel and Thomas to confront the fallout of their actions alone. "Rachel," Thomas said quietly as she entered. His voice trembled, a mixture of regret and fear. "We need to talk. I know what I've done is unforgivable, but please, let me explain." Rachel stared at him, the anger and sadness boiling inside her. "Explain?" she repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "How can you explain this, Thomas? How can you explain what you've done? You've destroyed our family. You've destroyed me." She paced back and forth, her chest tightening with every word she spoke. "You slept with Eli, our adopted son, and you want to explain? There's no explanation for this. There's no excuse, no reason that could ever make what you did okay." Thomas stood up, reaching out toward her, but she stepped back, her eyes full of contempt. "Stay away from me." He sank back into the chair, his face etched with the weight of his choices. "I never wanted to hurt you, Rachel. You have to believe that. I made a mistake. But this wasn't something I planned. I didn't know what was happening until it was too late. And when I realized it, when I realized what it had become, I was too far gone. I couldn't stop it." Rachel's voice was cold, cutting through the air like a knife. "You've destroyed everything, Thomas. You've taken everything from me. My trust, my love, our family. I never thought I'd be in a situation like this. I never thought you could betray me like this, with him, of all people." The words stung, and Rachel's eyes burned with unshed tears. She had given everything to this man, to their marriage and to their family. She had stood by him when times were tough, when people doubted them, and now everything was shattered and nothing could fix it. Thomas sat there, his head bowed in shame. I know it's unforgivable. I don't expect you to ever forgive me, Rachel. I know I've lost everything. But I need you to understand that what happened with Eli was something I couldn't control. I thought I was helping him, but it turned into something I never wanted. Rachel felt a wave of disgust wash over her. She had heard enough. I can't listen to this anymore. You think this is some kind of mistake? Some kind of accidental slip? You think I'll just forgive you for this? No, Thomas, you're a monster. You've betrayed me in the worst possible way. The truth hit her like a freight train. She realized then that she couldn't stay in this house. She couldn't stay in this marriage. There was nothing left to hold on to. I'm leaving, Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with pain. I can't do this anymore. Thomas's eyes widened in horror as she reached for her coat. Rachel, please, don't leave. Please, just give me a chance to make it right. I'll do anything. But Rachel, shaking with anger and sorrow, turned away. You've had your chance, Thomas, and you've thrown it all away. She walked out of the house, leaving behind the man she had once called her husband, the man who had betrayed her trust and shattered her heart. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she realized that there was no going back. There was no way to fix the irreparable damage that had been done. The life she had known was over, and she had to walk away. Rachel didn't go far. She called a friend and spent the night at their house, trying to calm her thoughts and collect herself. But even after the harsh confrontation with Thomas, there was still a gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach. She had left him, but she knew things were only going to get worse. The next morning, Rachel returned to the house to collect her things. She didn't want to face Thomas again, but she knew it was necessary. She didn't want to leave behind any of her belongings. This was her home, and she wouldn't let him take it from her. When she walked into the house, she found Thomas waiting for her in the living room. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with a mix of regret and desperation. Rachel, please, Thomas pleaded, standing up as she entered. Don't do this. I know I've made a huge mistake, but I'm begging you. Please don't leave. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. Please just give me a chance to prove I'm still the man you married. Rachel, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, stared at him for a long time. She knew in that moment that she had to leave, but she also knew that this wasn't just the end of her marriage. It was the end of something much larger, something deeper. As Rachel turned to leave, something inside Thomas snapped. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not after everything he had done. Desperation took over, and in a fit of rage, he grabbed a nearby object, a heavy glass vase, and swung it toward Rachel's head. Rachel's scream echoed through the house as she fell to the ground, blood spilling from her forehead. Her body trembled as Thomas stood over her, his face contorted with fury. The man she had once loved had turned into a monster before her eyes. Rachel's world spun violently as she collapsed to the floor. The force of the blow was immediate and unforgiving. The sharp edge of the vase hit her temple with such force that her vision blurred, her head feeling like it was about to split open. The blood began to pour down her face, pooling beneath her and staining the carpet with every ragged breath she took. Pain, overwhelming pain, blurred her thoughts. She could hear Thomas in the background, his voice muffled by the ringing in her ears. His words were unintelligible, filled with desperation and panic, but there was a coldness in his tone that sent a shiver down her spine. It was as though something in him had broken, completely shattered, and the man she had known was gone, replaced by someone she couldn't recognize. Rachel tried to move, tried to push herself up, but her body refused to cooperate. Her arms felt heavy, her legs numb. Blood dripped into her eyes and the world around her began to darken. She tried to call out, tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the life had been drained from her with that single violent strike. Thomas stood above her, breathing heavily. He was still holding the vase, now shattered in his hands. The pieces of glass lay scattered on the floor, reflecting the light that filtered through the window. His mind was racing, but it was clear to him now. Rachel had pushed him too far. She had left him. She had exposed him, humiliated him, and now she was going to walk away from everything they had built together. I couldn't let you leave, Thomas muttered to himself, his voice ragged. His breath was shallow and his hands trembled as he looked down at Rachel's motionless body. You don't understand. I couldn't let you walk away. His mind spun, torn between the remnants of his guilt and the intense anger that had overtaken him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He never meant for this to escalate, but as the blood stained the carpet beneath Rachel, he felt a sense of finality that he couldn't escape. In a moment of madness, he had done the unthinkable. And now as the minutes ticked by, reality began to set in. What had started as an unthinkable betrayal of their marriage had escalated into something darker, something irrevocable. Rachel was lying there unconscious, and he had no idea what to do. His hands were shaking as he knelt beside her, brushing the hair out of her face. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry," he whispered, but even to his own ears, it sounded hollow. The doorbell rang then, and the sound broke him from his trance. He froze. Someone was at the door. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind scrambling for a way out. He needed to think. He needed to fix this. Clara Jones had been on the case since Rachel's disappearance the day before. The news had come in that Rachel had gone missing, leaving the house in the middle of the night without a word to anyone. She had left her phone behind, and there were no signs of a struggle or foul play, just a woman gone without a trace. Clara had already begun her investigation when a call came in from Rachel's close friend. Lisa had told Clara that Rachel had been planning to return to the house and confront Thomas one last time. The situation had been volatile between them, and Lisa had an unsettling feeling that something terrible might happen. Clara's instincts told her she needed to act fast. She and her partner, Detective Mike Simmons, had arrived at the house and approached the front door. The door was slightly ajar, and Clara felt a shiver of unease crawl up her spine. "Something's not right," she muttered, signaling to Simmons to follow her. They stepped into the house, guns drawn. Clara's eyes immediately scanned the room, taking in the broken vase, the shattered glass scattered across the floor. And then her gaze landed on the bloodstains, a trail leading toward the living room. "Rachel?" Clara called out, her voice steady but urgent. She stepped carefully, her senses heightened. But there was no answer. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she advanced cautiously toward the living room. And that's when she saw it, the body of Rachel Harris lying motionless on the floor. Clara rushed forward, kneeling beside her, checking for a pulse. She was still alive, barely. Her breathing was shallow and blood was pooling around her head. "We need an ambulance," Clara shouted to Simmons, who immediately called it in. She quickly moved to stop the bleeding, pressing her hands against Rachel's head. "Stay with me, Rachel," Clara whispered, her voice soothing, though fear gripped her heart. "Stay with me." Clara's mind raced as she pieced together what she knew. Thomas. He was the only one who could have done this. But why? What had driven him to this point? The paramedics arrived soon after, rushing Rachel out of the house on a stretcher. Clara stood frozen in the living room, taking in the scene around her. The broken vase, the glass shards, the bloodstains. This wasn't just an accident or a fit of rage. It was calculated. Within hours, Rachel was in the hospital, her condition critical but stable. Clara was able to speak with her briefly, but the woman was groggy and unable to provide much information. However, Rachel's eyes flickered with recognition when Clara mentioned Thomas's name. "Thomas did this." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough. Clara's blood ran cold. There was no question now. Thomas Harrington had crossed a line that no one could come back from. As Clara began to investigate further, she discovered more troubling details. Thomas had been hiding his abuse behind a mask of charm and charisma for years. His relationship with Rachel had never been as perfect as it seemed. There had been whispers of control, manipulation, and emotional abuse long before the physical violence. Thomas had a dark side, and it had finally erupted. Clara pieced together a timeline of events. Thomas had been caught in an affair with a member of the church years ago, something he had kept hidden from Rachel. But when the affair had ended, his guilt had only festered, and his need for control over Rachel had become more intense. He had manipulated her, isolated her from friends, and emotionally tormented her. But when she discovered the truth and finally confronted him, he snapped. By the time Clara had all the pieces, the case was clear. The pastor's once pristine image had shattered into pieces, revealing the monstrous man beneath the pulpit. Thomas was arrested for the brutal attack on Rachel, and he was charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and domestic abuse. But Clara knew that the physical wounds would heal, though the emotional scars would remain for Rachel forever. The community was stunned by the truth. The man who had led them in faith was now behind bars, and the devastation he had caused reached beyond Rachel's wounds. It had hurt everyone who had ever placed their trust in him. Rachel, however, was determined to rebuild. Her path to recovery would be long, but she was strong. She would not let Thomas's actions define her future. The town of Greenville was still in shock. The man they had trusted, the pastor who had served as a spiritual leader, had been revealed for the monster he truly was. Pastor Thomas Harrington's arrest had sent waves of disbelief through the community. People who had known him for years, who had sat in his church, had listened to his sermons, were now grappling with the horrifying truth about who he had been behind closed doors. For Rachel, the path to recovery had only just begun. Physically, she was healing. Her head injury had been treated, and the bleeding had stopped. But the emotional toll was far greater than anything the doctors could address. Every day, she fought a battle against the nightmares, the memories, and the overwhelming feeling of betrayal. It was one thing to be hurt by someone you loved. It was another to be betrayed by the person you had entrusted with your heart and your future. Rachel had stayed at her friend Lisa's house for the first few days, unable to face the reality of her own home. But eventually she returned, unable to avoid it any longer. She had to confront the remnants of her past, even if it meant facing the house where everything had gone wrong. As she stood in the doorway of their home, the memories flooded her. Thomas's smiling face, their shared laughter, the peaceful mornings where they sat together, drinking coffee. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the violence that had unfolded here. The house felt cold now, empty, even though she was standing in it. Rachel stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. It was as though nothing had changed, until she noticed the broken vase lying in the corner of the living room. The sight of it made her stomach turn. In the weeks following the attack, Rachel began the process of rebuilding her life. Her attorney had advised her to file for divorce, which she did almost immediately. There was no question that she would leave Thomas. But even with the such legal steps in motion, Rachel was still haunted by the question of why Thomas had done this to her. What had pushed him to the point of violence? How had she missed the warning signs for so long? The answer, Clara would soon discover, lay in Thomas's past. A past he had kept hidden from everyone, including Rachel. Clara had been relentless in her pursuit of the truth. She had worked with the local authorities to gather all the information they could about Thomas's past. His public image had been one of righteousness, but Clara had uncovered a different story. Thomas Harrington had not always been the man he appeared to be. It began with a few whispers from people who had known him long before he became the pastor in Greenville. Some spoke of his temper, others of his strict upbringing, but there was one person who had the most to offer: Eli, the adopted son. Eli had been quiet throughout the investigation, and Clara had trouble getting him to open up. But eventually, in a moment of vulnerability, he revealed the full extent of the situation. Eli had been living with Thomas and Rachel for the past 2 years. He was a troubled teenager when they took him in, but they had offered him a fresh start, or so it seemed. At first, everything had appeared normal, until Thomas began to show a darker side. Eli admitted that Thomas had often manipulated him, just as he had done with Rachel. Eli had become a pawn in Thomas's twisted game of control, and that game had turned violent. He didn't just do this to Rachel, Eli confessed to Clara one evening. He did it to me too. It started small, just comments, manipulation, but then it got worse. He tried to make me feel like I wasn't good enough, like I didn't deserve to be here. I didn't realize how much of it was him controlling me until it was too late. Eli's voice cracked as he continued. One day things just crossed the line. I was young, but I knew what he was doing. I couldn't escape it, and I couldn't leave. I thought Rachel was the only one who could help, but she was blind to it too. She didn't know how deep it went. I thought I'd be okay, but then she caught us, and I knew she'd never forgive us for what happened. Clara felt a pang of sympathy for Eli, who had been a victim as much as Rachel. He had been caught in a trap he couldn't escape. But the more Eli spoke, the more Clara realized how deep the darkness ran in Thomas's life. Rachel learned of Eli's confession a few days later. She wasn't surprised by the revelation, but it filled her with a deep sadness. She had always thought that taking Eli in had been a selfless act, a way to give a troubled child a chance at a better life. But now it seemed that Thomas had only used Eli to further his control, manipulating both him and Rachel in ways that were now too clear to ignore. Despite everything that had happened, Rachel didn't hold Eli responsible. He had been a victim in all of this. But she couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if she had seen the warning signs sooner. As the weeks dragged on, Rachel continued to push forward. She moved out of the house and into a small apartment, where she began the process of reclaiming her life. The divorce was finalized quickly, and Thomas's reputation, once held in such high regard, was permanently tarnished. The people of Greenville were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered faith. The church, once filled with worshipers, was now mostly empty. The congregation had split, some members unable to reconcile the man they had adored with the monster he had turned out to be. Others, however, remained loyal, refusing to believe that their pastor was capable of such brutality. Thomas's arrest had not only destroyed his marriage and his family, it had fractured the very foundation of the community that had once supported him. Rachel knew it would never be the same, and neither would she. But she was determined to move forward, to rebuild her life, and to find a way to heal from the trauma that had consumed her for so long. Rachel's first step toward healing came in the form of therapy. The pain of betrayal had nearly broken her, but with the help of a therapist, she began to untangle the web of emotions that had taken root in her heart. She worked through her anger, her fear, and the sadness that had clouded her vision for so long. It wasn't easy, but she was making progress. She also began speaking with other women who had been victims of domestic abuse. Some of them had experienced similar manipulation and control from their partners. Rachel realized she wasn't alone, that there were others who had walked through the same hell she had. It didn't make the pain go away, but it gave her hope. 1 year later, Rachel stood outside the courthouse, her hands clasped in front of her. She had just finished giving her testimony in the civil suit against Thomas. He had been sentenced to prison for his assault on her, but the emotional toll of what he had done would last a lifetime. But Rachel was no longer the woman who had walked into that house months ago. She had found a new strength, one that was hers and hers alone. She had learned to reclaim her life, to take back the pieces that had been stolen from her. And as she looked toward the future, she knew she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. The scars would remain, but they no longer defined her. She was free. The months following Rachel's divorce from Thomas had been a time of tumultuous rebuilding. She had left behind the man she had loved, the man who had once been her partner, her confidant, and her greatest betrayal. Now she was learning to live in the shadow of a life she never thought she would have. But with each day, Rachel grew stronger. Though the worst of the storm had passed, the emotional scars remained. Every day felt like a step forward, but every night was a battle. When she woke up each morning, the thought of being free from Thomas brought her a sense of peace. But when she closed her eyes at night, she was still haunted by the images of the past, the betrayal, the violence, the lies. Rachel had decided not to return to the church, not for a long while. The place that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. She needed space, time to heal away from the people who had once worshipped the man who had destroyed her life. But healing was never a linear process, and Rachel soon found herself facing the consequences of Thomas's actions in ways she hadn't expected. The ripple effect of his abuse and betrayal reached far beyond their marriage. It had seeped into the very fabric of their lives and their community, affecting people she didn't even know. One afternoon, Clara Jones, the seasoned investigator who had worked on the case, contacted Rachel to ask if they could meet. Rachel, now settled into her new life, agreed reluctantly. She wasn't sure what Clara wanted, but she appreciated the woman's diligence in investigating the truth behind Thomas's actions. They met at a quiet cafe just outside of town. Clara had a warm, understanding smile, but Rachel could see the fatigue behind her eyes. This case had clearly taken a toll on Clara as well, especially given the way it had shaken the town to its core. "Thank you for meeting with me, Rachel," Clara said, setting down her coffee. "I know it's been a difficult time for you, but there's something I need to discuss." Rachel nodded, her hands wrapped tightly around her own cup. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had missed talking to someone who truly understood the gravity of what had happened. Of course, Rachel said, her voice calm but guarded. What's on your mind? Clara hesitated for a moment before speaking. I've been investigating Thomas's past, his life before you two met. There's something you need to know. Rachel's pulse quickened. The thought of Thomas's past brought with it a flood of memories, each more painful than the last. But she was determined to face whatever Clara had to say. What is it? She asked, her voice steady, despite the anxiety building inside her. I've uncovered more about Thomas's childhood, things he never spoke of, Clara continued. It turns out that Thomas wasn't just the victim of abuse. He was also deeply involved in controlling and manipulating others as a young man. Rachel frowned. What are you saying? Clara leaned forward, her gaze intense. I found records of incidents from when Thomas was in high school. He had relationships with multiple women, and they all reported feeling controlled, isolated, and intimidated. This pattern of abuse didn't just appear in your marriage. It's been there his whole life. Rachel's heart sank as Clara spoke. The man she had once seen as a partner, someone who had built their life together, was a man who had been a predator long before he ever met her. It wasn't just about the affair or the violence. Thomas had a pattern, a darkness that had been festering for years. Clara continued, her voice quiet but firm. I also found out that Thomas's previous relationships ended under similar circumstances. He isolated the women, manipulated them, and then discarded them when he no longer had control. You were not the first to suffer, Rachel, and that's what makes this so tragic. He's never had to face the full consequences of his actions before. Rachel sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of Clara's words. The man she had thought was a loving husband, the man she had believed to be a righteous figure in the community, had been a master of deception. His abuse hadn't started with her. It had been part of him all along, hidden beneath the guise of the perfect pastor. I never knew, Rachel whispered. I thought he was a good man. I thought I was the problem, that I wasn't enough. But all this time, he's been the one who needed help. Clara gave her a sad, understanding look. You weren't the problem, Rachel. It was never you. But Thomas knew how to make you feel that way. And the most painful part is that he's never had to face the consequences of his actions until now. As the days passed, Rachel began to realize that the healing process would be far more complicated than she had anticipated. It wasn't just about moving on from Thomas. It was about understanding the full scope of what had happened and reclaiming her sense of self. Her identity had been tied to her role as Thomas's wife for so long, and now she had to rediscover who she was without him. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, Rachel made a decision. She would no longer remain silent. She would take her story to the public, not for revenge, but for justice. She needed to tell her side of the story. She needed to speak for all the women who had been manipulated, controlled, and abused by men like Thomas. Rachel reached out to local news outlets, and within days she was sitting down for an interview. The station's anchor, a woman named Jenna Matthews, listened to Rachel's story with empathy and understanding. Rachel knew this would be difficult, but she felt a sense of empowerment with every word she spoke. She wasn't just telling her story, she was giving a voice to the women who had suffered in silence for too long. When the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. The town of Greenville, once so captivated by Thomas's charm, was now reeling from the truth. The interview became a catalyst for other women to come forward, each with their own story of manipulation and control at the hands of Thomas. As Rachel watched the community respond, she felt a mix of sadness and relief. The man who had destroyed her life was now exposed, and his lies could no longer hide in the shadows. But she also realized that the damage he had done reached far beyond her. It had affected more than just his victims. It had affected an entire town's perception of truth and trust. But Rachel was determined to rebuild. The past would always be a part of her, but it wouldn't define her future. She would keep fighting for the women who had been silenced, and she would continue her journey of healing, one step at a time. The town of Greenville had changed in ways Rachel couldn't have anticipated. In the weeks following her interview, the story of Thomas's Betrayal, abuse, and manipulation spread like wildfire. The truth had finally been brought to light, and with it came the weight of realization for many who had been blinded by Thomas's facade of holiness. While some people in the town still defended Thomas, unable or unwilling to believe the truth, there were many others who felt betrayed and angry. It was as though the town had been living in a false reality, and now the veil had been lifted. There was no denying the consequences of Thomas's actions, and now Rachel was faced with the aftermath of her decision to speak out. For Rachel, the decision to tell her story had been both liberating and terrifying. She had opened herself up to the judgment of her community, her friends, and the world. But she had also found a sense of purpose in her voice, something she hadn't known she had. She was no longer just a victim. She was an advocate for the women who had been silenced and for the truth that had been buried for so long. But as the weeks passed, the emotional toll of the situation began to take its toll on Rachel. Though she had been brave in speaking out, there were moments when the weight of everything she had endured crashed down on her. One evening, Rachel sat in her apartment, staring out the window. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the city, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. She had started seeing a therapist, and though the sessions helped, there were still days when she felt overwhelmed by the memory of what Thomas had done. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Rachel wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, she found a familiar face standing on the other side. It was Eli. Rachel's first instinct was to slam the door, to push him away. But as she looked at him, his face full of uncertainty and regret, she realized that he was just as much a victim in this situation as she had been. Despite everything that had happened, she still remembered the young man he had been when he first entered. Their home, the boy who had needed love and guidance. And even though he had been a part of Thomas's deception, Rachel knew that he was still struggling, still searching for answers of his own. "Rachel," Eli said softly, "can I talk to you?" Rachel hesitated for a moment but stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "What do you want, Eli?" Her voice was calm, but there was a coldness beneath it. I don't know how to say this, but I'm sorry," Eli began. "I'm so sorry for what happened, for what I did. I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't know what he was capable of. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you." Rachel sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You knew, Eli. You saw what he did. You could have stopped it. I should have," Eli admitted, his voice breaking. "But I didn't. I was so lost, so afraid of what would happen if I said something. I never thought it would go this far. But now I can't undo it. I can't change what happened." Rachel felt a wave of empathy wash over her. Eli had been caught in the same web of manipulation and control that Thomas had spun. He had been a victim too, just like her. But that didn't mean she could forgive him. What he had been complicit in had caused her immeasurable pain. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Eli," she said quietly. "You were part of the reason my life was turned upside down. But I also know that you were just a kid when all this started. You didn't deserve any of this either." Eli nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll never ask for your forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything. And if there's anything I can do to make it right, anything at all, I'll do it." Rachel looked at him, her heart conflicted. She knew that Eli was a victim too, but the pain of what Thomas had done still burned deep within her. "I don't think there's anything you can do, Eli," she said softly, "but thank you for coming here. It's the first time I've heard you say you're sorry, and I think it's the first step for you too." Eli stood up, wiping his eyes. "I'll leave you alone now. I just wanted to say that. And I hope you find peace. You deserve that." As he walked out of the door, Rachel felt a strange sense of finality. She didn't know if she could ever fully heal from the wounds Thomas had inflicted on her life, but hearing Eli's apology and knowing that he too had suffered gave her a small sense of closure. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel continued her journey of healing. She had stopped attending church and had distanced herself from the community she once loved. The betrayal was too much to bear, and she couldn't bring herself to step foot in the place that had been the source of so much pain. But as the seasons changed, so did Rachel. She began volunteering at a local shelter for women who had experienced domestic abuse, hoping that helping others might help her heal. She shared her story with them, spoke about her journey, and listened to the stories of those who had been through similar struggles. It gave her purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. One day, Clara called Rachel with some news. Thomas had been convicted of multiple charges, including assault and domestic abuse. He was facing a long sentence in prison. Rachel had expected this news, but hearing it made everything feel more final. The trial had been another painful chapter in her story, but it was also a necessary one. Thomas had been held accountable for what he had done, and that brought Rachel some peace. It was a small victory, but it was hers. As she sat in her apartment, Rachel thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the pain, the healing. She had come a long way from the woman who had been trapped in that marriage. And though the scars would never fully fade, she knew she was stronger than she had ever been. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Rachel felt ready to face the future. Time had a strange way of healing wounds, but for Rachel, it felt like a slow, steady process. The months following Thomas's conviction had been filled with small victories, each one reminding her of her strength and resilience. Every step forward had been hard-earned, but she was no longer the woman she had once been. She had reclaimed her life piece by piece, and with each day she grew stronger. However, healing wasn't just about moving on. It was about rebuilding, and that's what Rachel had been doing with her life. She had created a new path for herself, a path that no longer relied on her past. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of the memories seemed unbearable. But the people she had met along the way, those who had supported her, had given her the strength to keep going. Rachel had come to terms with her past, but she was learning to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made. The guilt that had followed her, the feeling that she should have seen the signs earlier, began to fade. It wasn't her fault. She had been a victim too, and now she had the power to rewrite her story. One of the most difficult parts of Rachel's recovery had been facing the community. She had once been the pastor's wife. Someone mentioned Thomas's name, and the pain of it was still raw. But now Rachel had reached a point where she no longer cared about the opinions of others. She had her own truth, her own path to follow, and that was what mattered. She had no control over how others saw her, but she did have control over her own life. She had spent too long living for someone else, too long defining herself by the man she had married. Now it was her time to find peace. Rachel had kept in touch with Clara over the months. The investigator had become more than just a professional contact. She had become a friend. Clara had been there through it all, offering support when Rachel needed it most. The case had ended, but their friendship had only deepened. One afternoon, Clara invited Rachel out for coffee. It had been a while since they had spent time together outside of the case, and Rachel was eager to catch up. They met at the same cafe where they had first spoken about Thomas's past, and as Rachel walked in, she noticed that Clara seemed unusually excited. "Rachel?" Clara greeted her with a warm smile. "I have some good news." Rachel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Good news? I could use some of that." Clara laughed, taking a seat across from Rachel. "Well, you know that support group for women you've been helping with? The one you've been volunteering at?" Rachel nodded. She had become deeply involved with the group, offering counseling and emotional support to women who had been through similar experiences. She found it incredibly fulfilling, but she hadn't expected it to turn into something more. "What about it?" Rachel asked. Clara's eyes sparkled. "They want to honor you. They've seen all the work you've done, and they think you deserve recognition for your strength and your courage. They're offering you the chance to lead a new program. They want you to be the face of it." Rachel was stunned. She hadn't expected anything like this. The idea of leading a program, of being the one to help others who were struggling, felt both humbling and empowering. It wasn't just about her recovery anymore. It was about helping others find their own strength. "I don't know what to say," Rachel murmured. "This is all so unexpected." "You don't have to say anything right now," Clara said. "But I think it's time for you to step into the role you were always meant to have. You've spent so much time healing and growing, and now you're ready to give back. It's your chance to rebuild." not just for yourself, but for others too. Rachel's heart swelled with emotion. She had never imagined she would find herself in this position, leading a program, helping others, becoming a beacon of hope for women who had been through similar pain. But in that moment, she realized that this was exactly what she had been meant to do. This was her new purpose. "I'm scared," Rachel admitted. "I'm scared of failing. I'm scared of not being good enough." Clara smiled kindly. "Rachel, you've already come so far. You've faced your worst fears and survived. This is just the next step, and I know you'll succeed. You were made for this." The next few months were a whirlwind for Rachel. She began leading the new program for women recovering from abuse, drawing from her own experiences to help guide others. She worked closely with the women in the group, listening to their stories, offering advice, and supporting them through their struggles. It wasn't easy, and there were times when the pain of her past resurfaced. But with each woman she helped, Rachel felt a sense of healing she hadn't known she was capable of. The work wasn't just about helping others, it was about helping herself. Every woman who came to the group brought something new into Rachel's life, a reminder that healing was possible, that redemption was real, and that there was strength even in the darkest of moments. Rachel didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid to face it. She had found her voice, her purpose, and her peace. Months later, as Rachel stood in front of a room full of women, sharing her story with them, she realized just how far she had come. She had walked through the fire and come out the other side stronger. Her past no longer controlled her. It had shaped her, but it didn't define her. Rachel had spent so long running from the truth, from the pain, from the man she had loved. But now standing here, she knew that she was in control of her own future. And no matter what came next, she would face it with strength, grace, and the wisdom she had earned through every battle she had fought. In the end, Rachel didn't just rebuild her life, she transformed it. And in doing so, she found the greatest redemption of all,